When America woke to the black smoke of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, its Pacific Fleet was crippled. Battleships lay burning in the harbor, aircraft destroyed on their runways, and the pride of the Navy seemed gone in a single morning. But beneath the chaos, untouched in their pens, a handful of steel sharks still waited, the submarines. They were small, outdated, and outnumbered. Yet within months, these hidden boats would become the tip of America's vengeance, the silent service. The submarine fleet made up less than 2% of the U.S. Navy. It was an afterthought before the war, underfunded, undertrained, and often ignored by admirals who believed wars would be won by battleships. But as the smoke cleared over Hawaii, Washington realized a hard truth: the only weapons that could still strike Japan directly were those that could reach it unseen. Submarines became America's first and only means to take the fight across the Pacific. Their mission was brutal in its simplicity: sink everything that fed Japan's war machine. Oil, food, troops, ammunition. If it sailed under the rising sun, it was a target. To the men who volunteered for submarine duty, it meant long months in the dark, cut off from the world, surrounded by steel and silence. They called themselves boat crews, not ship crews, because submarines weren't ships, they were living, breathing machines. A crew of 80 men packed into a vessel barely 300 feet long. When they dove, the air turned thick, the heat unbearable, and the noise of the engines became the heartbeat of survival. "You never forget that you're inside a bomb," one submariner later said. Life aboard was a strange mix of boredom and terror. For days, there was nothing, no contact, just the endless hum of the Pacific. Then, suddenly, everything happened at once. A lookout's cry, "Ship spotted," would send the crew to battle stations. In seconds, the boat would dive, engines silent, as they crept into firing position. Every man held his breath, every sound a potential death sentence. Then the captain's voice: "Fire 1. Fire 2, a hiss, a rumble, and the crew waited for the sound they both craved and feared, the muffled thunder of an explosion far away. At first, the missions were disasters. Torpedoes malfunctioned, failing to detonate even when they struck a target dead on. Japanese escorts hunted the subs with depth charges, dropping hundreds at a time. Entire crews vanished, gone without a trace, entombed forever beneath the waves. But the men kept going, adjusting, learning, perfecting the art of invisible warfare. By early 1942, the submariners had earned a reputation even among their own: reckless, inventive, sometimes insubordinate. They fought in secret, earned no headlines, and buried their dead at sea. Yet they understood what few others did: the ocean was a battlefield without witnesses, and silence could kill just as surely as gunfire. They began to call it the Silent War. No parades, no radio broadcasts, no glory, just steel tubes slipping into the deep, hunting lifelines that kept an empire alive. These men didn't know it yet, but they were about to rewrite the history of naval warfare. The United States had been caught unprepared, outgunned, and humiliated, but in the dark heart of the Pacific, the submariners would strike back, unseen and unstoppable. And as one commander would later write in his patrol log, "We have no monuments, no witnesses, no bands. Only the sea, and the ships that will never reach Japan." In the early months of 1942, the American submarine campaign in the Pacific was a string of bitter disappointments. The Navy had expected its undersea fleet to strike terror into Japan's shipping lanes, but instead it faced mechanical failure, indecision, and disaster. Commanders went to sea full of vengeance, and came back in silence, their torpedoes having failed to explode, their fuel nearly gone, their crews demoralized. The Mark 14 torpedo, the Navy's primary weapon, was supposed to be the most advanced in the world: fast, reliable, deadly. On paper, it was flawless. In reality, it was a catastrophe. Submarine captains watched in disbelief as perfect shots, point-blank hits against Japanese ships, produced nothing but dull thuds or no sound at all. Some torpedoes ran too deep, others circled back toward the firing sub. More than one boat nearly died by its own hand. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington refused to believe the reports. The problem, they insisted, is poor aim, not faulty design. So the men in the Pacific went on fighting with broken weapons, risking their lives for kills they couldn't make. For months, submarines fired hundreds of torpedoes and sank almost nothing. The Japanese convoys continued to sail unchallenged, their war machine fueled by oil and steel from the Dutch East Indies. The failure wasn't just mechanical, it was strategic. Submarine warfare required boldness, but early in the war, the U.S. Navy was shackled by fear of mistakes. Commanders were ordered to avoid attacking near neutral waters or coastlines, to save torpedoes for major targets, to report rather than strike. Meanwhile, Japanese destroyers hunted them relentlessly, dropping depth charges by the dozens. The water shook with each explosion, lights flickered, pipes burst, men clutched their bunks and prayed the next one wouldn't find them. The first months became a test of endurance. In one patrol after another, submarines limped home with no victories and stories of near death. The crew of the USS Sargo surfaced after 48 hours of pounding from Japanese escorts, the boat covered in soot, men bleeding from their ears. Another, the USS Ceylon, was caught in harbor and destroyed before it ever fired a shot. The Pacific was enormous, and for a time, America's submarines seemed lost within it, blind hunters with blunted fangs. But the crews learned. They studied Japanese convoy routes, tracked radio transmissions, and experimented with new tactics. They practiced end-around attacks, surface runs to outflank their targets, and tested the limits of their fragile machines. Above all, they refused to quit. Every patrol was a lesson, one captain said later. We just didn't know what the lesson was yet. By the summer of 1942, the frustration reached a breaking point. Too many good men had died for nothing. In Pearl Harbor, Commander Charles Swede Momsen, an engineer and innovator, began demanding real tests of the torpedoes. And when the truth finally surfaced, it would shake the Navy from top to bottom. The silent service had survived its baptism of failure. The next step was revolution and revenge. By mid-1942 the frustration in the submarine force was unbearable. Crews had risked everything, fired perfect spreads, and watched Japanese ships sail away untouched. It wasn't bad luck, it was betrayal by their own equipment. Deep in Pearl Harbor's submarine base, angry captains gathered evidence, dud torpedoes hauled back from patrols, unexploded warheads recovered from beaches, data that proved what they had long suspected. The culprit was the Mark 14 torpedo, a weapon sabotaged by bureaucracy. Its magnetic exploder was supposed to detonate beneath a ship's keel for maximum damage, but in the real ocean it misfired or exploded prematurely. The contact detonator jammed on direct hits. Depth regulators were miscalibrated, making the torpedo run 10 feet deeper than set. Every flaw meant another crew hunted and killed in vain. Commander Charles Swede Momsen and Captain John Crosby refused to accept silence. They demanded live-fire tests, something the Bureau of Ordnance had forbidden to save resources. In Hawaii, they ran their own experiments, firing torpedoes into the cliffs at Kahoolawe. The results were undeniable, perfect strikes that simply bounced off the rock. Washington could no longer deny the truth. It took months of argument and near mutiny before the Navy authorized field repairs. Crews began disabling the magnetic exploders with hammers and files, trusting their instincts more than manuals. Mechanics worked night shifts redesigning detonators out of spare metal. The fleet's submarines became workshops of defiance, each boat its own laboratory, each captain a tinkerer warrior. Once fixed, the difference was immediate and deadly. In late 1942, the USS Wahoo, under Lieutenant Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, stalked a Japanese convoy through the Bismarck Sea. 4 torpedoes struck true, 4 ships went down. For the first time, the crew felt the shuddering boom of victory instead of the sickening silence of failure. Morton radioed a single word to Pearl: success. Across the Pacific, morale soared. Submariners who had nearly lost faith now knew their steel spears worked. The tables were turning. The Japanese merchant fleet, long unguarded, confident in its control of the sea lanes, was suddenly vulnerable. The Navy learned another lesson, just as vital: innovation couldn't come from offices, it came from men in the fight. The captains who had been reprimanded for reckless behavior were now being decorated. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarine Force Pacific, told them bluntly, "Sink ships, nothing else matters." By early 1943, the once flawed weapons of the silent service had become instruments of precision. The ocean that had sheltered Japan's empire was about to become its graveyard. The hunters had teeth again, and the Pacific would soon tremble under the rhythm of torpedo strikes echoing in the deep. By 1943, the balance in the Pacific had begun to shift. The once invincible Japanese merchant fleet was bleeding, and the predators responsible were America's submariners, the so-called wolves of the Pacific. They were a breed apart, inventive, fearless, and unrelenting. In an ocean that covered 1/3 of the planet, they hunted in silence, striking at night, vanishing before dawn. The transformation had begun with a handful of extraordinary commanders. Dudley "Mush" Morton of the USS Wahoo became a legend almost overnight. Charismatic and aggressive, he broke every rule in the book, and rewrote submarine warfare in the process. Morton believed in attacking on the surface at full speed, using the sub's silhouette and moonlight as camouflage. His daring was matched only by his trust in his executive officer, Richard O'Kane, who would later command the USS Tang. Together, they became the most feared partnership in the Pacific. On one mission, the Wahoo slipped into WWII Harbor, deep inside Japanese territory. Morton fired a full spread of torpedoes at anchored ships and then surfaced to finish the survivors with gunfire, a reckless act that electrified his crew and horrified his superiors. But when Wahoo returned to base, her victory pennant bore 7 new flags, 7 ships sunk in a single patrol. Morton's message to headquarters was blunt: "We can do more if you let us fight our way." Other captains followed suit. Eugene Fluckey of the USS Barb turned the sea into a laboratory of audacity, inventing new ways to outsmart convoys and escape detection. Red Ramage, commanding the USS Parcha, would later make a solo surface attack through a Japanese convoy at point-blank range, firing torpedoes manually from the bridge under machine gun fire, and survive. The submarines became floating testbeds of tactics and courage. They traveled thousands of miles from base, often alone, sustained by stale air and salt-crusted food. They called the smell inside the aroma of the silent service, diesel, sweat, and oil. Depth charges were constant companions, explosions rattled steel hulls until bolts wept saltwater. When they surfaced at night, crews gulped the open air like drowning men. The Japanese began to fear them. Their merchant captains spoke of the American devils below, invisible hunters who struck without warning. Convoys grew larger, destroyer escorts multiplied, but the submariners adapted. They learned to trail convoys for days, striking from different angles, coordinating attacks over radio silence. A single American submarine could paralyze an entire supply line. By the end of 1943, the statistics told the story: Japan's merchant losses had tripled, while American subs suffered only a fraction of their earlier failures. The silent service was no longer experimental, it was decisive. But every victory came at a cost. Boats like the Wahoo and Cachalot vanished without a trace. Sometimes only a slick of oil marked their graves. When a sub didn't return, there were no headlines, no funerals, just a simple message to families: overdue, presumed lost. Still, the submariners pressed on. Their war was fought in darkness, measured not in battles won, but in tons of shipping destroyed. And as 1944 approached, the wolves of the Pacific were preparing for their deadliest hunt yet: the systematic destruction of Japan's entire maritime lifeline. By 1944, the silent service was winning, but at a terrible price. Submarine duty had become the most dangerous assignment in the U.S. Navy. 1 in 5 submariners would never return. For every victory pennant raised in Pearl Harbor, another crew vanished beneath the Pacific, their names engraved only on the sea. The submariners called their boats steel coffins, half in jest, half in truth. Life aboard was claustrophobic and brutal. The heat from the engines kept the temperature above 100 degrees. The air reeked of diesel, sweat, and ammonia from the batteries. Fresh water was rationed, showers were forbidden. The men shaved dry, slept beside torpedoes, and ate canned food that smelled of oil. Weeks passed without sunlight. Time was measured not by days but by depth charges. When a Japanese destroyer found them, hell began. The submarine would dive to 300 feet, sometimes 400, past its rated limit. Lights flickered out, the hull groaned like a living thing, rivets squealing under pressure. Then came the first explosion, a concussion that rattled every bone. Dust rained from the ceiling, glass shattered, gauges spun wild. Between attacks, there was only silence and the hiss of air escaping somewhere it shouldn't. Men stared at each other in the dim red light, listening for the next explosion. Some prayed. Others simply waited. When it was over, they surfaced, repaired what they could, and hunted again. The same crew that had just stared death in the face would soon be laughing, smoking, eating what they called coffee and nerves. Humor was their armor, superstition, their religion. Some boats carried lucky charms, a rabbit's foot, a photo, a coin welded to the console. No one questioned them. But the losses were relentless. Boats like the Wahoo, Runner, Grampus, and Grayback vanished without a trace. Families received telegrams that read only, overdue and presumed lost. There were no funerals, no graves, just an empty berth at Pearl and a plaque on the submarine memorial. Each time a boat failed to return, another quietly took its place. The war did not pause to mourn. Still, morale among submariners remained defiant. They were proud of what they did, proud of the secrecy, of being the unknown warriors. "We're the ghosts," one sailor wrote home. "Nobody sees us, but they'll feel us." Even when success came, it came at the edge of death. In 1944, Commander Sam Dealey and the USS Harder sank 5 destroyers in a single patrol, a feat never equaled. On his next mission, he was hunted down and destroyed with all hands. His crew's final transmission was one word: attacking. That was the life of the silent service, victory measured in tons of enemy shipping, paid for in human lives. They knew the odds, they knew the risk, and they went anyway. Because in the end, for these men, the ocean was both their battlefield and their grave. And if they had to die, they would die where they had lived. Silently, unseen, and undefeated beneath the waves. By the beginning of 1944, the wolves of the Pacific had perfected their craft. Every patrol was now an ambush, every surfacing a calculated risk. The lessons bought with blood in the early years were paying off. The once scattered boats of the silent service now moved in coordinated wolf packs, sharing intelligence and attack zones. For the first time, the U.S. Navy had turned the Pacific into a submarine battlefield, and Japan's empire was beginning to suffocate. Japan's entire war effort depended on the sea. Its home islands had almost no oil, rubber, or iron of their own. Every bullet fired, every plane flown, every ship built came from supplies hauled thousands of miles from the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and China. The submariners understood this, and they aimed straight for those arteries. The war they fought wasn't glamorous, it was mathematical. Each sinking meant fewer engines turning, fewer bombs built, fewer soldiers fed. By mid-1944, the results were catastrophic for Japan. American submarines, less than 300 of them, had already sunk hundreds of merchant ships and dozens of warships. Tankers burned across the South China Sea, or carriers vanished in the night, and the once crowded shipping lanes turned into graveyards. Japan began rationing fuel for its navy. Entire fleets were ordered to remain in port. Pilots couldn't train. Destroyers couldn't sail. The empire was running out of blood. One of the deadliest patrols came from the USS Tang, commanded by Richard O'Kane, the same officer who once served under Mush Morton on the Wahoo. O'Kane's aggressive tactics, closing to within 900 yards before firing, terrified the Japanese. In a single night in October 1944, Tang sank 5 ships in quick succession, scattering a convoy and sealing a record that would never be broken. But the cost remained high. The deeper the submarine struck, the tighter Japan defended. New escort tactics, radar-equipped planes, and sonar traps made every mission a gamble. The USS Harder, under Commander Sam Dealey, became a legend after sinking 5 destroyers in 5 days, but on its next patrol, it disappeared, taking all hands with it. The ocean gave victory and demanded payment in return. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy realized too late that its empire was bleeding out beneath the waves. Japan tried to build smaller convoys, sent ships under cover of storms, even disguised freighters as hospital ships. It didn't matter. The submariners adapted faster. The ocean was too big, the hunters too skilled, the silence too deadly. By the end of 1944, Japan had lost over half of its merchant fleet. Factories slowed to a crawl, cities began to starve, and its once mighty navy was trapped, fueled only by desperation. The campaign had done what bombing could not, it had strangled an empire without ever showing its face. The silent service had found its power not in numbers or size, but in precision and patience. In the still black of the Pacific, the submariners had become masters of invisible war, cutting Japan's lifeline one ship, one convoy, one heartbeat at a time. By early 1945, Japan was collapsing. Its cities burned under American bombs, its fleet lay rusting in shallow bays, and its factories stood silent for lack of oil. Yet the submariners of the silent service fought harder than ever. For them, there would be no rest until the final ship sank and the last convoy disappeared from the sea. The submarines now prowled the enemy's doorstep, the East China Sea, the Yellow Sea, even Tokyo Bay itself. What had begun as hit-and-run raids had become open-season warfare. Submariners called it the turkey shoot, though none used the phrase lightly. Every patrol meant risk, every dive could still be the last. In February, the USS Batfish hunted off Luzon and, within 4 nights, destroyed 3 Japanese submarines, a feat no other Allied vessel would ever match. 2 months later, the USS Barb under Commander Eugene Fluckey prowled along the coast of Japan itself, surfacing under moonlight to unleash torpedoes at a train of oil tankers. When the ships erupted in fire, Fluckey refused to flee. Instead, he ordered a landing party ashore, the only U.S. ground operation on the Japanese home islands, to sabotage a railway line. Minutes later, an ammunition train exploded, lighting the sky for miles. Fluckey's daring defined the last phase of the undersea war, fearless innovation against a dying empire. The submariners had become more than hunters. They were scouts, rescuers, and saboteurs. They pulled downed airmen from the sea, pilots of B-29s and carrier planes who would have otherwise perished. Some submarines, like the USS Finback, saved dozens of aviators, including a young Navy pilot named George H. W. Bush. Yet triumph was never far from tragedy. The USS Tang, commanded by Richard O'Kane, met a cruel fate in October 1944. After sinking 13 ships on her final patrol, the most of any American sub, one of her own torpedoes malfunctioned and circled back. It struck her stern, killing most of the crew instantly. O'Kane and 8 others were thrown into the water and captured. They spent the rest of the war in a Japanese prison camp. As the war dragged toward its close, fuel shortages forced Japan's surviving ships into desperate measures, sailing only by night, hugging coasts, cloaking decks with nets and camouflage. None of it worked. The American submarines had mastered radar, sonar evasion, and surface attack tactics. Convoy after convoy vanished into the depths. By the summer of 1945, the once proud Japanese merchant fleet had been annihilated. The submariners had sunk over 1,000 ships, 55% of Japan's total losses. Without fuel, Japan's remaining warships were trapped in port. Without supplies, its armies starved across Asia. The empire had been strangled by silence. But for the men of the silent service, victory was not celebration, it was survival. Every harbor they returned to had empty slips where friends should have been. Every medal felt like a memorial. "We didn't win the war," one captain said later. "We just made sure it ended." As the atomic bombs fell and Japan finally surrendered, the submariners surfaced for the last time. The war beneath the waves was over. They had fought in darkness, won without glory, and changed the course of history, unseen by the world above. When Japan finally surrendered on August 15, 1945, the war in the Pacific ended with the echo of silence, not from the roar of victory, but from the submarines surfacing for the last time. The men of the silent service came home quietly, their battle unseen, their achievements known only to those who read the numbers. Less than 2% of the U.S. Navy had destroyed more than half of Japan's merchant fleet. No ticker-tape parades awaited them. Submarine warfare was secret, invisible, unglamorous. They had no flags to wave, no cities to liberate. But in the cold math of war, their contribution was staggering. Over 1,300 Japanese ships sunk, including 8 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, and countless destroyers. They had severed Japan's arteries, choked its industry, and starved its armies across Asia. At the heart of this triumph were the men: 52 lost submarines, 3,505 officers and sailors who never returned. Their graves were the depths of the Pacific, marked only by the coordinates in their patrol logs. For every survivor who walked down the gangway in Pearl Harbor, there were others who stayed forever below, their boats sealed in darkness and salt. In the years that followed, their story was almost forgotten. The headlines went to the bombers, the Marines, the admirals. But among those who knew, the shipbuilders, the intelligence officers, the rescued airmen, there was an unspoken understanding: without the submariners, Japan would never have surrendered so soon. The empire had been defeated not just by fire from the sky, but by hunger and isolation beneath the sea. The submariners called their fallen comrades the Eternal Patrol. Their names are carved into marble walls at the U.S. Submarine Memorial in Pearl Harbor, one boat after another, one generation of ghosts. Visitors sometimes bring coins or miniature flags, but the sailors who served with them say the most fitting tribute is silence. "That's how we fought," one veteran said, "and that's how they rest." After the war, the technology advanced: nuclear power, sonar, guided missiles, but the spirit of the silent service never changed. Modern submariners still train in the same discipline, the same secrecy, the same code. They know their heritage was born in those years when every dive could be the last, when the Pacific was a graveyard, and courage was measured in quiet resolve. Looking back, Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the submarine fleet in the Pacific, said it best: "We shall never forget that our submarines held the lines against the enemy while our fleets replaced losses and repaired wounds." The silent service didn't win through numbers, glory, or noise. They won by vanishing, and in doing so, they helped end one of history's greatest wars. Beneath the waves, far from the parades and politics, they found their victory in silence. Their legacy endures. Not in headlines, but in the stillness of the ocean, where 52 submarines lie as monuments to men who fought unseen and never came home.